About a century and a half ago, the people of France, no strangers to revolution and turmoil, contributed one of the most famous symbols of America, Lady Liberty. A poem at the base of the statue was written by one of those refugees from Eastern Europe. We were in the midst of another great wave of migration, and she wrote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free."
Who came to America? Well, in this segment, I'm going to move a little closer to how the English arrived here, how the English became the basis of the language for the Americans in the form of the United States that followed. But let's take first a look at the many seas. Um, First, there were conquerors, and the conquerors tended to be the Spanish, conquistadors. We've talked about them some already. I'm going to talk about them a little, but they're not going to be the center of conversation. Beyond conquistadors were into conquering. They were into bringing down an existing civilization and taking over because there were a lot of assets there. The situation in the north for the British, French, was somewhat different. The other aspect of this we need to talk about is capitalism. The idea that we can take assets, that we can invest capital, that we can, through trade and through manufacture, increase the wealth of nations. Um, if you ask an economist, they would say, well, these are probably rules that have been around in existence for quite a while. But we're entering a period where some thoughtful people were able to conceptualize what this aspect of economy was like, and others would react to it later and write about it later, but that comes later. But the important thing is remember that a great deal of what was driving these this early colonization had very little to do with establishing colonies, establishing beachheads for European civilization around the world. It had to do largely with bringing wealth back to Europe, to whichever ruler happened to be running the operation at any given time. And the motives really weren't that mixed. Money. We want money, we want assets, we want food, we want gems, we want gold. Gold, yeah, gold was very popular. Okay. Now let's look at some people that we can probably empathize with a little more. And these are the people I call the chance seekers. Europe, coming out of the medieval period, in the midst of the Renaissance and working its way through the Renaissance, had a lot of really brilliant people, had a lot of really interesting thought going on, had a lot of really poor people, had a lot of really oppressed people, had a lot of people who would just as soon not be in the country that they happen to be in. And for those people, the mystique of America, the place over the horizon, was strong enough that that they would venture everything, and they would get to that other world, that new world from their perspective, in any way that they could, because they saw that as a chance to perhaps get out from under the thumb of either their rulers, poverty, or of the local environment. But in any case, if you were on the bottom, America offered the opportunity to change that, to at least move out from under the bottom, even if it doesn't move you to the top. And this this should not be underestimated as being a great screening tool. The people who had the courage to get on boats and and pay to get on boats and go to those foreign shores had to be truly brave hearts, because there was going to be no welfare. There was going to be no one looking out for them once they got here. They had to be prepared to sustain themselves, and that was a cruel taskmaster. When you're in the wilderness, you either succeed or you die. So hats off to the chance seekers. Then, and many of these will overlap, of course. There are a few capitalists seeking their chances. Churchmen and women. As I focus more on the British establishment on the eastern coast of North America, religion and different perspectives on religion drove a fair amount of that. And there was a very wide range of different perspectives that were driving people to come here. Because particularly in that era, religious people tended to be intolerant of one another. They would cluster in different parts of the landscape, but this was, part of overcoming this very hostile environment is to have a strong belief in your heart that you're doing the right thing, that you are, as one of our early settlers put it, establishing a city on the hill, establishing an example for the world, establishing a little bit of heaven on earth. So hats off to them. And then there were contractees, and there were a lot of contractees. Now, what's a contractee? Contractee is someone who can't afford the fare to this new land, who might not even necessarily want to go, but they are, for one reason or another, in a contract to go to the New World, to serve as an apprentice, to serve as a servant, to serve in some capacity, often for a limited number of years, 5 years, 10 years, to pay the passage, to pay the cost of getting there, and to pay the tuition. We're learning a trade, perhaps, once you arrive in the place. So many people ended up here for that reason. And then there's criminals. And criminals get kind of a bad name because, well, they commit crimes. But I think we have to view these criminals with a little bit of reserve, because they were caught up in a great process in Britain of eliminating anyone who was a drain on the economy. And, in some societies, you do that by killing people. But in others, maybe you put them in a boat, you transport them to someplace like Georgia or South Carolina, or maybe Australia later on, or New Zealand. But you get them out of your society. They may not be the kind of criminals that I tend to think of as a criminal, murderers, rapists, grand theft types. These more likely are people who are dirty and hungry, who stole a piece of bread. Perhaps they stole it for themselves, perhaps they stole it for the country, their family, but they may not be crimes that we would view as high on the list of being worthy of being expelled from the country for. but different times. And finally, there's the chained. There's the people who are taken captive and brought to the New World without any choice. Uh, and that's a complicated process, but it's a bad process. And this probably fits within the idea of rulers of, well, the other empires have slaves. Shouldn't I have slaves? What's wrong with that? Well, I won't say the ethics of the age were impaired, because there's plenty of examples of impaired ethics still with us, but certainly this was a poor mode of operation to take on what had happened. So we'll discuss that.
Why do they come? Why did they come? The early migrants from Great Britain came for more than one reason: to embark on the flimsy ships of that time, bound for what was likely to be a hostile shore, required enormous courage. The trip was more like boarding a hastily constructed space station to Mars than going for a nice, safe plane ride. The reasons that they came were multiple, and usually more than one per person, but I see them as being church, chance, contracts, crime, and chains. The soon to be Great Revolution in England itself was the source of new Americans. The Puritans sought religiously based life that was different than that offered by Catholicism or the Church of England. This being a period when dissenters ended up being burned at the stake or occasionally crushed, becoming pilgrims to a less hostile shore was attractive. Two streams of people formed the earliest immigrant groups from England. One in the north were the Protestants seeking the opportunity to practice a religion that was separate from the Church of England and separate from the Catholic Church. John Winthrop was the head, or one of the early heads and governors of the Boston Bay Colony in 1630, which had originally been founded in 1620. Before that, there were settlers in Virginia, uh, and their motivations were different. They were more cavaliers, more from the royal supporters, and they had a different view of their reasons for being in the colonies. But for those in the North, for those around the Boston colony, they had the vision of building a city on a hill. So it was a birth of an American ideal. To the mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, and their founder, well, was Penn. The Quakers had a yet another view of religion and how to live together that was different from that of the people in the North and of the people in the South. Positive and negative motivators were probably common, but about 600,000 people made their way to America seeking a chance to live a different life, that they might have more in their own hands than would have been the case in England. They were seeking a chance to live a free life. Especially among these were the Scots and the Irish. Their migration based on faith, family, and freedom, and particularly no British, um, reflected several hundred years of contention with their English neighbors. These groups moved through the coastal towns and on into the wilderness and the mountains. Coming to the British controlled shores offered some improvement over conditions at home, but moving beyond that control offered greater opportunity. These groups moved on out into the wilderness and into the mountains, and basically were able to cut themselves off from control by the British. Then there were many thousands of criminals who were packed off mostly to sparsely populated parts of the South. These criminals probably were reasonably tame compared to the murderers and rapists and more brazen thieves who often ended up at the end of a rope. These were more likely to be excess population without a role in the economy being transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Then there were many indentured servants, many indentured workers, about 4,000 over the century. And basically, they were people who were seeking a new life, couldn't afford passage on the boat, hadn't committed crimes that would cause them to be sent. So they basically made contracts with people who were already in the New World to pay for their passage and to pay perhaps for tuition to learn a new trade. The English were not alone, not entirely, although not for long. The Swedes founded short-lived colonies in Delaware, as did the Dutch in New York, but were soon pushed aside by the British. And then there were those who came in bondage and against their will. And there were many of those, not quite so many to North America as to South America and the Caribbeans, but many. At that time, um, trades of all sort around the world were developing, and a piece of that trade often involved people, using people to as property. And this was true in both the western and eastern side of Africa. It was true of Europe. It was true of parts of Asia. So people as trading goods was a common problem. The transatlantic slave trade itself probably uprooted about 12 million people and moved them into North and South America. And as I've suggested, the plantations of South America and of the Caribbean were more attractive for slave owners, more adaptable to that type of economy, and therefore many of the millions ended up in those areas. But some of them did, in fact, a good number, end up in what was to become the United States. Before 1490, there was no question about the identity of Americans, at least to an outsider. They were the American Indians. They, of course, did not regard themselves as Americans, and they didn't regard themselves as Indians, nor did they regard themselves as one group of people, but they were definitely not Europeans. By 1550, that had started to change and fairly rapidly. The Spanish incursions began, the Portuguese incursions began, the ravages of disease reduced the population of American Indians so that the picture or profile of what an American might be was definitely starting to change by then. 100 years later, the whole tapestry becomes much richer. The Indians, as a proportion of the population, much smaller. The Spanish and Portuguese held their footholds in Central and South America, and in the case of the Portuguese, in Brazil. But the English were becoming well invested on the eastern coast of North America, and the French, particularly in France and central to western Americas. Another 100 years and more complexity, um, more immigration from France, more immigration from the Scotch and the Irish, basically trying to put distance between themselves and their English neighbors, and also a lot more migration within the Americas themselves, so that the French in Canada didn't necessarily stay put, and um, and the Africans in the southern states of the British colonies didn't necessarily stay put if they could get away. And then by 1776, the mixture includes all of the above in different proportions, with more movement within the boundaries of North and South America. More migration would come, more changes to the American identity would come. A lot of it based simply on the people entering into the American continents and the people reproducing in the American continents and the people being oppressed in the American continents. Over time, uh, changed the makeup of both North and South America. By the end of the 18th century, the combined growth of population through immigration and birth created a cluster of colonies with comparable numbers to those of the people in England itself. Perhaps as important as the emerging American identity as a separate people, um, any aspect of character or idealism that set us apart was the simple fact that with this large population, we could relinquish English control. So we revolted, partially at least, because we could.